So this is my presentation on my exploration of the question, how has the surrealist movement in the 1920s influenced the work of modern photography? I decided to study this question because when I had previously looked at the timeline of photographic processes, I noticed a distinct change in the perception of the craft after the movement was established. There was a clear transition from practical to creative formats, which I thought would be really interesting to explore. So there are three main events that contributed to the popularity and success of the surrealist movement. The first was the Great War, which occurred from 1914 to 1918. The huge loss of life, suffering and destruction occurring as a result of the war meant people began to question the success of the mechanised society they were living in. In 1916, a group of artists formed the Dada movement and became pioneers of this belief. The artists encouraged people to experiment with different tools and styles of art in order to express themselves and change the current perceptions. The movement dissipated when the surrealist movement became established in 1924, when Andre Breton published the Manifestation of Surrealism. He defined surrealism as a psychic automatism in its pure state by which we propose to express. Like the intentions of the Dada artist, who promoted art as a means for expressing liberated thought, Breton wanted to transform the current reality at the time, alter the rigid constructs of society through the medium of photography. It was known as surrealism for its controversial, mind-altering nature that paved the way for creative expression for years to come. I haven't established an ending for the surrealist movement because my research proves that movements such as the situationalism, counterculture, and punk rock movements all aim to change the status quo and prevent the suppression of expression through creative mediums like photography, art, and fashion. This ultimately was catalysed by the surrealist movement and is responsible for the huge success of the digital industry today. It's also worth mentioning that prior to its establishment there was a shift in society's attitudes, not only due to the aftermath of the Great War, but thanks to the suffragette movement that enabled women to vote in 1918. The first source I used to research was the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I thought was a really reliable option because it is the largest art museum in America and they have a variety of different educative writers that publish articles on the site. That I found interesting about this quote is the fact that they suggest that surrealists really rejected this idea of sober calculation, as they said, or the more practical and technical aspect of photography. I think this is interesting because nowadays I definitely feel like it's a combination of the practical and technical skills and your ability to use your creativity to produce something that has made photography so successful. I think that maybe over the years a middle ground was established with this. I used a number of sources for my secondary research. The first was the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I've already mentioned. I used this site to gauge some of the key information about the movement, like influential photographers such as Man Ray and Maurice Tabard. Being able to see these different artists' work really enabled me to gauge an understanding of the massive variety of different ways in which people interpreted surrealism. It ranged from the subjects of the photos, to the composition of the photos, to the use of colour, to the use of inversion. There were tons and tons and tons of different ways that people had used this new concept in their work. The Met is the largest art museum in America, and so I thought it was a very reliable source to use. They also recommended a collection of primary and secondary essays alongside the article I was reading, which was also really helpful to. The second source that I used was a site called lightstalking.com. I'd actually used this blog before. They post a number of different articles on tips and tricks to do with photography, by a range of different photographers. So the one I used for this project was How Has Surrealist Art Impacted Photography? I'd established the connection between the past processes involved in photography and the new ones after the movement with the last source. So with this one I was really keen to gauge a further understanding of other influences outside the photography genre. The article basically helped me understand that the premise of surrealism was about encouraging liberated thought and using the creative platforms as a means of expressing this. The article talks about how photography soon became established as a fine art subject and uses a timeline to show the progression of the movement over the years, despite the fact that I disagree that the surrealist movement ended in 1945, as I've discussed previously. I used my previous research of Florence Henry to explore somebody who was able to adapt the surrealist concept not only aesthetically in terms of composition or lighting, but also in the subject matter. She explored themes like gender, identity, sexuality, just through her images, and I think that was where there was a step up from the change that surrealism was igniting. I decided to compare Florence Henry's work to modern day photographer Tim Walker, who I'm quite familiar with because he frequently does cover shoots for ID magazine, which I read. Tim Walker has this famous series that he's done where he photographs celebrities in unusual and interesting ways. Often they look barely recognisable. I think surrealism is often grounded in reality, presenting something that we are familiar with, but also has to be littered in references to either the unknown or a fantasy world or a topic that is controversial. There's some edge to it, basically, and I think Tim Walker does that in his series, and so does Florence Henry in hers. I also used a blog called truecenterpublishing.com just to get a quick summary of some of the characteristics seen in surreal photography so that I could compare the two artists and see similarities and differences between them both. So one thought I had when I was researching this project was, at the moment we are existing in an incredibly liberal society, and I thought, how can people continue to practice this concept of surrealism when the world already has explored so much of it? So for my primary research, I was looking for an exhibition that really focused on pushing the boundaries within society and changing perspectives. I found a local exhibition called the Red Retrospective. They had a brief summary of what to expect, which I've included on this slide. I understood that they were focused on blurring the boundaries and celebrating diversity, gender fluidity, body positivity, and sexual freedom, which I felt was really in tune with the research that I'd done and could be a really interesting example of the influence of the movement today. After being given permission to photograph the exhibition I attended later that week, for me the exhibition was a surreal experience. It was immersive. There were poetry readings, songs performed, and everybody except me was in some sort of costume. I found it humorous that, as wacky as the costumes were, I actually appeared more alien for not being dressed up and looked very out of place. The photographer who had taken the photos on display was called Jessica Kathleen Brady, who was also a performer. The photos definitely covered the themes of identity, gender, sexuality, and they had a candid edge which provided an element of mundanity amongst something that by society's standards is very unusual. I felt that there was a real sense of pride and celebration conveyed from the photos. Drag queens and ladies with animal masks on their faces are not things you see every day, and yet in this room, full of people dressed like this, for an hour it seemed normal. I was able to experience not only the impact of surrealism through the photos at the exhibition, but also in person. I took some photos of some of the performers that were attending the exhibition. I wanted to convey a sense of how immersive the exhibition was. In terms of evaluating the success of my research methods, I found that both the secondary and primary research I did was equally helpful. The secondary research really helped me establish what the surrealist concept was about right in the early stages of its development in the 1920s. It's really interesting to see how the concepts that then were revolutionary are so well used now, which provoked me to think about and question if surrealism could exist in a world that is changing so rapidly. My primary research helped me answer this in regards to Tim Walker study versus Florence Henry. I learned that although the themes used in the photography may not be as groundbreaking due to the fact that society has adapted, as photographers you can use different things like styling and composition and lighting and subject choice to still try and change perspectives of the same themes, just using different methods. And I think that is what I saw in my primary research at the Red Retrospective exhibition. My perspective of the same themes that had been touched on by both Tim Walker and Florence Henry were changed, because ultimately every person has a different perspective on something, so you can't really run out of ideas to explore. So, to conclude, I think that the surrealist movement in the 1920s definitely has influenced the work of modern photographers. I think that in just the fact that we see photography as a creative tool in the 21st century was, partly due to the surrealist movement and the idea that it was no longer going to be solely a technical, practical device. The research I did on my timeline shows that from the point of the surrealist movement, the print and commercial industry flourished, and today that is one of the biggest industries in the photography world. We are constantly buying products because of the photo on an advertisement that we saw on a billboard. We are donating to charity because of photos released showing devastating disasters. We are constantly influenced by the photos that we see in the media. Surrealism enabled photography to be an influencing factor in decisions that we make every day. Our perceptions are constantly changed, and visual aids help us to adapt to new realities. So ultimately, I do think that the surrealist movement of the 1920s has influenced modern day photography.